So this is the STEM grad school breakout session. So we have our panelists, Akanksha Gurtu. Did I say that right? Sorry if I did. And Colton Lysaker.
Colton Lysaker. Yep.
Oh, Lysaker, sorry. Thank you. And everybody else here is, everyone else is here to learn more from the two of you about your experience with graduate school. So before we get started, I would like to ask Akanksha and Colton to spend a little bit more time to give a more in-depth background of, where you were from, what your educational path was, how did you end up choosing the career or the major or the degree that you did end up choosing, and what some of your decision-making strategies were. So Akanksha, why don't we start with you?
So I did my undergrad from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. And going into my undergrad, I was actually a pre-med major. So I was planning on going to medical school and doing the pre-med route. And then I actually took a research course, and that's what sparked my interest in doing research. And then I was also a WiSys ambassador. So I learned about patents and then intellectual property. So that also helped my, goal to become and go into graduate studies and do Ph.D. And I'm kind of non-traditional because I graduated in May 2020 and I took a gap year. So my gap year was planned to travel and do those sorts of things, but because of COVID, all of that was kind of put to halt, and I also majored in philosophy, which is not STEM, but my philosophy major was it was concentrated in biomedical ethics. So it related to science. And I also minored in chemistry. So that's a bit about my history. And right now I joined the Medical College of Wisconsin. So I'll be starting in a few weeks. So this year I applied, I went through the process, interviews and everything, and I got accepted, and I'll be joining in a few weeks. So I haven't started yet, but right now I'm in MCW. I'm working in a lab over the summer as a research tech in biochemistry in a biochemical lab. That's a bit about me.
Thank you, Akanksha. Colton?
Yeah, so I'm Colton Lysaker. I'm originally from Wisconsin, so I did my undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. And there I majored in molecular biology and genetics. And I originally started kind of on the pre-medicine track as well. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was thinking pre-PA or cytotechnology, which is identifying cells that aren't functioning correctly. So you're looking at masses from patients, biopsies and stuff like that. So I was kind of interested in that. And then I joined a research lab actually starting the spring semester of my freshman year, and I really enjoyed doing research. And from there, I decided to apply to graduate school, and I ended up applying to 8 schools in total. And I actually applied pre-COVID, so it was the fall leading into COVID, so fall 2019, spring 2020. And I actually was able to, I'm not sure about Akanksha, but I was able to do in-person interviews for my graduate school. And so I can probably touch on that if Akanksha can't. And I ended up deciding to go to the University of Kansas Medical Center for my PhD. And I actually did a interdisciplinary program, kind of what Akanksha is going into. And so I did 3 rotations and then picked a lab in neuroscience.
Yes, my interviews were all virtual. All the interviews were virtual, and we had virtual visits. So yeah, I didn't get the in-person experience.
And I bet that is an important part of the admissions process, right? And Colton, maybe because you got to do a little bit of that, or maybe a lot of that, because you said you applied to 8 schools. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of your decision-making process around the admissions criteria that you were thinking of? Were you considering size of school or types of degree programs? What made you pick your school?
Yeah, so for me, I think the biggest thing was location. So I wanted to stay in the Midwest just because that's where I'm from. So actually the University of Kansas Medical Center was the farthest institution I applied to. So it's about 7 hours away from home. And I'd say the second biggest part was finance, like so financial support from that program, because I mean, if you're moving somewhere to a new city, you want that financial support and you want to be able to live off that financial support. And with some STEM graduate programs like mine, we signed a contract saying we want to have a second job because as a PhD student, you should be concentrating on your studies. And so with the in-person interviews, I think the biggest thing was collaboration and how, I mean, I guess the vibe I got from people if they were happy at that institution. So that was professors and current students, because throughout my interviews, I got to meet with professors, PIs, as well as current PhD students. And I think if you get that chance to go one-on-one with current PhD students or master's students, if you're applying to master's programs, to talk to them about their experiences there, because they should be honest with you about their opinions of that institution. I know when I talked to students and PIs, they said that students should be honest and upfront with what they think the institution's like and their thoughts on it. So I think it's important to have those questions laid out ahead of time for students and faculty members.
And Colton, did you have a sense of like which PIs you wanted to work with going into the interviews?
Yeah, I did. Not every, so since it was a rotation basis, they didn't, not all PIs had a sense of if they would be accepting rotating students, but being able to, and this is very important for STEM programs, looking at institution web pages and faculty members and seeing if those research areas interest you, because I know certain institutions have more focus on certain research areas than other institutions. Like my institution is really heavy into neuroscience and metabolism and stuff like that. And so it's important to look at faculty members' web pages to see what the research concentrations are at that institution.
Thank you. And Akanksha, I know you had a slightly different experience with it being during the pandemic and being virtual. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your decision process looked like?
Sure, it was really similar to Colton. Like my number one thing was location. Where can I see myself living for the next 4 to 6 years, basically? And Milwaukee is really close to Green Bay. It's like a 2-hour drive. And like similarly, I wanted to stay in the Midwest too. I applied to like Texas and like southern areas too, but I was like, I don't think I can move that far. So location was number one. And I agree with all the things that Colton said. Another thing that I looked at was research too ahead of time to see if I would make a good fit in some of the labs and if I could see myself, you know, doing that sort of research. And then, yeah, stipend was also a very big thing. And then also just like requirements, like some PhD programs required me to have a master's, and I went, like we both went straight from undergrad. So I was looking at some programs and then later found out, oh, you have to have a master's. So those were the things that I was looking for.
Thank you. So let's take a step back, right? So let's go back to when you were still an undergrad. During that time, who did you talk to? What was your thinking or process like in determining whether you wanted to go to grad school or not?
Yeah, I talked to my PI or like my research supervisor at the time. And I had 2 different ones because I was doing research in chemistry as well as biochemistry. So I made sure to talk to my professors. And then just, I mean, generally like any other professors in my like biology, like major classes. And I talked to them and asked them, is grad school a good fit? Should I do maybe like a post-baccalaureate program? And we kind of weighed the options together. And then I also did some more research on my own. But yeah, I mostly talked to my research supervisors and professors.
What about you?
Yeah, probably the same as Akanksha. I mean, I talked to a lot about my career goals to my undergraduate advisor, and he was also my PI. So I had a lot of conversations with him and his experience. And then as well as going through that process of if graduate school is right for me, specifically a PhD. I know some programs do what's the word I'm looking for? They did like a preview day for students who may be interested in applying to graduate school, not like an interview day, but like a preview day where you can go to that campus and get a sense of what they have to offer.
I'm also curious if either one of you had conversations with the student side of this population. Like, did you talk to any grad students who were maybe pursuing a PhD at that time?
No, I didn't, just because, I mean, UW Platteville doesn't have any graduate students, and I really didn't know who to talk to. So from there, I mean, I just made my decision based off of conversations with my advisor.
I actually was able to, now that you said that. I had two different students. One of them just had done their PhD and they were doing a postdoc in my lab. They were international students. So I got to talk to them about their different experiences. And the second student was actually doing her PhD while she was like in my lab. So I did get to talk to her and, talk about the work-life balance and, how did she apply? And it was international, so it was a bit different, but just her experience, working in a lab and things like that. So I did get to talk to two, I guess, PhD students.
That's good. And all of the other students who are here kind of have an advantage, right? Because they get to talk to you and Colton. So I want to make sure that all of you take advantage of this opportunity. I have a couple more questions kind of around the admissions process, but if any of you have questions, about the admissions process and, what Akanksha and Colton thought about or went through during that process, please feel free to put it in the chat and I will be keeping an eye on it. But as we wait for you to put those questions in, I'll go ahead and go through my own questions with them. So Akanksha, what was the timeline like for the application process? And I know with yours, it's a little tricky because, you're kind of doing this mid-COVID. And so I don't know if that affected the timeline, but could you talk about that a little?
Sure. So the normal timeline starts from like mid-September all the way through maybe March. That's when interviews are happening. For me, the first school, like there was one school that was open in August, like the application's open. So I was able to get all my things in. The major thing that I would say, like the application's open in September, but I was already kind of prepping from June and July, getting my letters of rec together, my personal statements. So I would say it starts like early summer and then goes all the way through the next year to like March, and then April is when the decision deadline is. I think they call it like National Decision Day, like April 15th. So yeah, so I guess applications open September, but I started ahead just to get everything collected. You have to ask professors, hey, would you be my letter of recommendation, and give them all that time to get it sorted out. So yeah.
And speaking of letters of recommendations, who did you approach, Akanksha, and how did you pick who you wanted that letters of recommendation from?
I wanted to pick someone, or I guess everyone that I picked was someone who knew me really well, and they had seen me doing, whether it's research or I worked at different jobs, like an optometrist place. So I asked a doctor who had seen me work. So I made sure that they would be able to speak on me as a person, like personally, as well as like in academia, research, or in the clinical setting, or like clinical setting.
Thank you. And what about you, Colton? Did you kind of try to find a range of people to get recommendations from?
Yeah, I did. So I tried to get someone from WiSys because I had experience through WiSys. So I ended up asking Tony, and then Tony was mentioning asking Arjun. So I asked someone more on the non-research side, but then ultimately, and this is important, if you're doing research, to ask your research advisor, because they're going to be a critical letter of recommendation to talk about your research abilities, because that's very important going into graduate school, whether it be, PhDs, it's research, so that's research is very critical as a prior experience. And then if you're doing a thesis-based master's as well.
Thank you. And was your timeline kind of similar to what Akanksha said?
Yeah, so I don't think COVID really changed the timeline at all. Maybe like it pushed some dates back for April 15th. I know since the pandemic started right around the time decisions were going out, some schools were more lenient on your decision. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case in the future. And then I started probably June or July just because I had to take the GRE. I'm not sure about Akanksha if she took the GRE, because I know some biomedical science programs are getting rid of the GRE. So that's something to look into as well, as if your program requires the GRE.
Can you tell me when did you take your?
I took my
Nice.
GRE in early August, just so I had time to retake it if I needed to. So, and I started studying about a month and a half ahead of time.
Oh, and speaking of that, can you tell us a little about, what your preparation process was like with the GRE?
Yeah, so I didn't take a prep course for it, but I bought some prep books for it that give you practice exams, and then walk you through how the exam is set up, and then some exam taking, how to take the exam properly. So walking you through how to manage questions and stuff like that. So that's primarily what I did. And then I know there's subject test as well. I didn't do the subject test just because I know there's, some advice I was given on the subject test is that if you don't think that you can do well enough to score high, then maybe you shouldn't take it, just because if you don't do well on the subject test, then schools may look poorly upon that. So I decided not to take the subject test. And I know most places don't require the subject test they just require the general exam.
Yeah, that was the same with me too.
You took a GRE as well?
Yeah, and I didn't take any like subject tests. I just prepared with it was called a 5-pound GRE book. And I just went through that. And I would just say pace yourself, give yourself enough time to study and really look at practice questions.
How much time did you give yourself, Akanksha, to prepare?
So I did it right before, so when COVID started, so about 2.5 months, but I was always preparing while I was doing my undergrad. That's kind of how I was with the MCAT too, because that's for medical school. So I made sure while I was taking my undergraduate courses, in biochemistry, organic chemistry, or even calculus, I was kind of keeping in mind that I will eventually have to remember this for the GRE or whatever exam.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think we have a question from Dominic. Dominic, if you don't mind, why don't you unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Okay. Hi, my name is Dominic. I'm a physics and mathematics student at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And I had kind of a weird question, but do either of you have anything you regret not considering during the grad school process, and anything that you kind of wish you had told the younger version of yourself just ahead of time?
That's a really good question. So for me, since the location was a big part, I was kind of freaking out about where I wanted to apply to schools, because in the Midwest, specifically for biomedical science programs, I'm not sure about physics, but there's not a ton of schools. There's more schools out to the East and West Coast, because that's where a lot of biotech industry is. So I was kind of freaking about that process of deciding where I wanted to apply. And so I'd probably tell my younger self not to. There's a lot of resources out there to help decide where to apply. And looking at graduate school websites, I wish I would have done that a little bit more, is looking at the programs websites, not looking at program websites in more depth, because I did that, but I guess looking for more programs within the Midwest, because after I applied, I found some programs that I'm oh, I guess I could have applied there as well, specifically at UW-Madison, because I applied to the cell molecular biology program, but it wasn't a biomedical science training program per se, but it was more of you go into the program and then I think you're allowed to do rotations, but yeah, it's just something I wish I would have looked more into when I was applying.
Hi, Dominic. So something that I have two things that come to mind. So the first one would be having a variety of people to edit all my personal statements and getting more people to look at them. So having that lined up, because once you have the same people to read over and over again, it gets kind of oh, it's the same person. So I would say that, so getting more people to edit your statement or even look at your application and make sure there's not any errors. And then the second thing would be to not stress. I was very stressed out right before interviews and during an interview too. And looking back at it, I can tell myself there was no need to stress. All the PIs, anyone who's interviewing you knows that it's stressful. You're just going into grad school or you're applying. So just don't stress and be yourself. That's what I would tell myself.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I had another question. I realized that both of you, it sounded like both of you did undergraduate research, right, through your programs. And I guess both of you also were WiSys ambassadors, so that's great. In addition to sort of actually doing research, what were some of the other extracurricular activities or courses that you took that you thought were valuable in the admissions process, that you thought gave you a leg up on the other candidates?
For me, it was, I think, my philosophy courses. Everyone was like, "You're a philosophy major? So like, what's going on with that?" So I would say just taking some more like general education classes and maybe taking like psychology courses or just something that's a bit different to give yourself a different perspective. And then what was your other question? Sorry, I forgot.
No, that was
Okay.
or other extracurricular activities.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was a part of philosophy club, and then I also love volunteering. So I started a organization called HIUPA, which was Youth for Unity, Virtue, and Action. And I got a bunch of our like students to come together. We do like volunteering events that had nothing to do with science. It was just fun and getting together, like doing like yoga, yeah, like having meetings. So I think that's another thing I did. And then outside of that, I just played a lot of sports and tried to stay active, like out of the lab. So those are a few things that I did.
What about
I
you?
would agree. I would agree with Akanksha 100% on that. I was part of a good variety of clubs, biology club, and then the pre-health society on our campus. And then I was a resident assistant as well, and I actually talked about that during my interview process. I think that's one of the only other extracurriculars other than my clubs was being a resident assistant on my campus. And I thought those were a really valuable experience for me.
Does anybody have other questions about the admissions process? Oh, here we have one from Douglas. Douglas, if you want to unmute and ask the question yourself, feel free.
Yeah, I feel like it would be a lot better than me trying to spell it out. So I'm I'm a physics major with an astronomy minor, and I want to study overseas in Germany for my postgrad. Is the application process for postgrad school kind of universal throughout all of academia, or is it strictly just for the UW system?
Are you talking as like graduate school, so post undergrad application the same overseas? Is that your question?
Oh, did I say undergrad? I meant postgrad.
Okay, so are you talking like post grad school?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess I'll ask the question, perhaps be a bit more clear. I am a physics major and I'm interested in doing a postgrad master's or PhD overseas. Is the whole admissions process pretty universal throughout the world, or is this just kind of for the UW system?
So I'm not sure if this is the case across the entire United States or for different areas of expertise. I know specifically for like biomedical science training, and like some microbiology, that type of stuff. In the US, if your ultimate goal is a PhD, a lot of people tell you to skip your master's. But I know overseas, like particularly in Europe, a lot, especially in like biomedical science, most people need a master's before going into their PhD. So that's definitely something I would look into, because I know some of those schools over in Europe and overseas have requirements that you need a master's before your PhD.
Yeah, and I'm not too familiar with like Europe, but I know in Canada, so I'm originally from Toronto, Canada. My dad did his PhD in Canada, and it's not like the application process, like I was talking to him about it, and it's pretty much the same as US. And then some countries, like Colton was saying, they do require a master's. So there's a like a master's and then PhD, and then if you want to go directly, there's a thing called a direct PhD program, entrance program, which is what me and Colton are in. So that's another name that you can look for if you wanted to go directly into PhD. It's called the direct PhD program. So that's the difference. I'm not sure about Germany though, but I know Canada is basically the same.
And I can weigh in a little bit here. So things might have changed. I got my PhD oh gosh, 10 years ago now. So I got my PhD in biomedical engineering, and my focus was neuroscience, kind of like Colton's, but especially in the neuroscience area. So I don't know much about physics, but Colton's right that European universities will often require a master's to be able to enter their PhD program. I will say though that oftentimes they're kind of tied in together. So you enter the master's program, and as long as you complete your master's requirements in a satisfactory way, you kind of progress into the PhD realm. If you do plan on staying overseas, you might want to look at the whole academic track, because it is different than in the US, where you kind of start and then you go, to assistant professor, you get tenure, you become associate professor. That process is a lot longer and slower in Europe. They usually have sort of conglomerates, if you will, of labs where you have this one head honcho who's been, doing research and is highly published, running the lab, with a bunch of sort of smaller modules that are run by also really great researchers, but it's not their lab. So it is a different culture, if you will, if you want to stay in academia. So I would explore that entirety of that timeline if you are interested in doing this overseas. I hope that helps, Douglas.
So pretty much it's the same whatever grad school you go to. You just do your research and then you see if you can get the requirements, basically. Like the whole process of like researching that, all that stuff, figuring out what school you want to go to.
Yeah, I mean, if your ultimate goal is to do research, then at least for your graduate school, you're going to want to have research experience, no matter if that's overseas or within the United States.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Another question? Matteo, if you want to introduce yourself and ask your question, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Matteo Lindberg. I am a senior at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire right now, majoring in biology, minoring in chemistry. And I'm thinking about going for an applied plant science master's. And I was wondering if the admissions process for like just a master's program is like similar or different to like the direct PhDs that you're doing.
Yeah, so since I didn't apply to master's, I don't have a lot of experience here, but I know that masters typically, they're going to require like personal statements, the same as PhDs, letters of recommendations, as well as the GRE, depending on if the program requires the GRE or not. I think it's pretty similar. I'm not sure about interviews though. So if you're probably thinking about doing like a thesis-based master's, probably reaching out to the faculty member ahead of time and discussing if they have openings in their lab at that university. Because some of even the PhD programs I applied to that weren't interdisciplinary, where you did rotations, I had to reach out to the PIs to see if they had openings. And so I know a lot of masters. I don't think a lot of masters are let you do rotations, and so I think probably reaching out to those PIs ahead of time is going to be important, and probably doing that later in the summer, so probably July or August, to see if they would have openings the following year in their lab. But I think the overall process is probably pretty similar.
Thank you.
Thanks, Colton. Matthew, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm a dual major in engineering and physics at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And I was just wondering, at like what point did either of you like decide on a graduate program? Because like that's kind of like why I'm dual majoring, is because I couldn't decide in undergraduate level whether I wanted to do physics or engineering. But I'm thinking maybe looking at like applied physics, because it's kind of both. So I mean, like there's like so many different like graduate programs just everywhere that I'm kind of overwhelmed to be like, oh, I can't really decide. And it feels like a really big decision, because it's going to be a lot of time spent on a very like specialized particular thing. And I'm not sure if I want to devote like so much one thing. I'm not sure. So like I guess what I'm saying is like, when did you decide like that you want to do like this particular thing? Like, let's say Colton, you are doing neuroscience. You know, at what point was it like your junior or senior year, or did you look at other programs while you're applying, or like how did you know like, okay, this is what I want to do, and like what kinds of things did you like think about, or like how did you find out like, okay, this is what I want to do?
Yes, so I can touch on that first really quick. With me, I didn't actually know I wanted to do neuroscience until actually a few months ago, because we had to do rotations in labs. And so I did a variety of rotations, and I'm not sure if like physics or engineering are the same. But I would say if you're having a hard time deciding where you want to go based off of your research interests, really looking at those university profiles and PI's websites and stuff like that to see what their interests are and see if your interests align with that. Because you're right, it is a lot of time that you're devoting to that. So you want to make sure you're making the right decision. And along the lines of requirements, like deciding on your major, I think the biggest thing is making sure that the courses you take meet the requirements of the institution that you're applying to. Because if you don't meet those requirements, then your application probably won't be considered. So making sure that you're taking the right courses for the institutions that you're planning on applying to. And I don't know if you have a list of places that you're interested in right now, but just keeping those things in mind when you're deciding on where to go.
Anything to add, Akanksha?
Yeah, I would agree with Colton a lot here. Just make a list, and it seems really overwhelming. I mean, you're deciding between different, I guess, research interests. But yeah, make a list, make a pros and cons list, as cliche as it sounds. You know, what do you like about this and what do you not like? And then eventually you'll come up with like, instead of like 3 places, you'll go to 2 and then 1, and then you can kind of focus on exactly what you want to do. So I'd say make a list, write it down, and just think through it, and don't stress too much.
Another thing I might add here, Matt, is given that you're kind of doing engineering and physics, you know, and you're looking at applied physics, those are usually very interdisciplinary departments. Same with neuroscience. So, for example, I was in biomedical engineering, but one of the reasons I picked the school I did was because I was allowed to do a rotation with a whole wide array of PIs from different departments. So even though I was in BME, I did my rotation with, you know, somebody in the psychology department, and I did my rotation with somebody who was at the med school. And then I did my rotation with somebody who was in the neuroscience department. So, you know, one thing you might want to look into, especially if you have a diverse set of interests and would like to explore all of them, is how collaborative and interdisciplinary the research teams are at the universities that you're looking at. And those are good interview questions too, because remember, an interview, you can ask them questions as well. So.
Yeah, I was just kind of wanting to follow up. So what are like rotations and how do they work?
So I know biomedical science, it's usually rotation heavy, and I'm not sure about other disciplines like physics and engineering. I know I had, as an RA, one of my residents was applying to PhD programs at the same time I was for engineering. And he was reaching out to faculty members directly, but I know some faculty members, because he was stressed out as well about like, about his research interests, like if he joined that lab, would he be happy in that lab? And I know one of the not an institution, but one of the professors mentioned that he could do like a rotation in 2 different labs. But I know that program specifically didn't have rotations. It's just something that professor offered. So I think when you're looking at these programs, deciding if you need to directly reach out to PIs to join a lab or if they have rotations. So I can't really touch on the physics end, but I think it's probably important to look and see if those programs have rotations or not.
And Akanksha, you did rotations as well, right?
I will be starting. So right now I'm just in
right.
the middle. I have to choose rotations, but yeah, just like Colton, I have to do like, I think we get a minimum of 3 and we can go up towards 5. So they start during your first year. So they're going to start in 2 weeks. The first year of classes, the first year of rotations. And then you can go and you can like have a Zoom meeting with potential faculty members and kind of talk through your strengths, weaknesses, what you want to do in research. So I also have rotations coming up.
Answer your question, Matt?
Yeah, thanks.
And that's actually a great segue into our next sort of segment, if you will, which is what's your experience been like in the program? And I know, Akanksha, you haven't quite started yet, so it might be a little bit difficult for you to answer these questions, but how has your graduate school experience so far been different from your undergraduate experience? And feel free to talk about, what you've garnered just from having those initial conversations, even if you haven't started, your rotations, for example.
Yeah, so for me, the biggest difference between a graduate school and undergraduate is classes. Like the amount of classes you take substantially drops off once you hit graduate school. I mean, my first year was an interdisciplinary program, so we had classes throughout my first year, but it was only like 2 hours a day, like 2 to 3 days a week. And then we had exams, and I will say that all of our grades were based off of exams, and I'm assuming this is how every PhD program is going to be. There's no homework or anything like that. It's reading a lot of literature and publications, and then your whole grade is based off of exams. So that was the biggest difference for me, is you don't have as many classes. It's going to be a lot of research. So for me, I think I only have 2 or 3 courses left, 3 depending on discussions with my PI about what classes I need to take, because you actually have a lot, at least for my program, you have a lot more freedom with the classes that you want to take. And then, yeah, pretty much a lot of my time outside of studying was devoted to the lab. So.
Thank you. And Akanksha, again, I know this might be a little bit of a tricky question, but I'm sure you've had some interactions with other people at your university and with your faculty members. What have you learned? What does your course load look like?
So yeah, my course load is really similar. Starting off, we have classes almost every day, but they're only like 2 or 3 hours. So it's basically one class. And then after, so like from 8 to 10, you have a class, and then 1 to 5, you're in lab every day. So it's your rotation. So we have 6-week rotations, and we do about 3 or 4. And what I've heard is that the major difference between grad school and undergrad is that you're kind of in charge of your own research, and you have to start thinking critically. There's going to be lots of like dead ends, and you're going to have to think on the spot and kind of create your own experiment and figure out what's wrong. Because in undergrad, it was more so like the PI would really help you and kind of guide you. And I mean, they guide you here as well, but there it's like you're given a project and this is the end and the start. But in your PhD, it's like I've heard like it can take many years just to complete it because it's kind of your own project then. So that's the major difference that so far I've heard and kind of experienced.
That's very true, what she said. I mean, at least with me, I mean, 2 of my rotations were very like independent. I mean, my 3rd and last rotation, actually, I think I saw the PI probably once or twice a week. I mean, well, he's from Switzerland, so he had a lot of family issues and stuff like that he had to attend to earlier. So he really wasn't available a lot. So a lot of my questions were directed towards the other students in the lab. So I didn't have a lot of interaction with the PI. And that's something important to consider when deciding on the lab or the PI. And this is whether you have rotations or not, is talking to the students about the PI and how they lead the lab and how they teach the students within that lab.
And that's a really good point, Colton. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you went about picking your PhD advisor and how important do you think that is?
Yeah, so for me, the independency aspect was important. So coming in straight out of undergraduate, I felt not as confident in my abilities. And so through my first rotation, my PI, she's a younger PI, so she understands like those struggles, and she went straight from undergrad to her PhD. So I felt like that was something I could relate to. My second 2 PIs was a lot more independent, and I had less interaction with them. And I wanted more interaction with my PI instead of just seeing them like once or twice a week, being able to see them every day to have discussions about your project and the problems that you're running into within that lab. Because, I mean, ultimately, your PhD is based off of the research that you're doing and the success that you're having in the lab. And I know, and when I say success, I mean not whether experiments are working or not, but I guess how well you're managing your time within the lab. So.
And are there any postdocs in your lab or other senior grad students that you can rely on?
Yeah, so I'm at a medical center, so there's not any undergraduates in my lab. I just want to point that out when considering institution, whether there's going to be undergraduates or who's in the lab. But for my lab, we have a senior research scientist. We don't have a postdoc, but throughout my rotations, there was postdocs in the labs that I was in. So a lot of the, or at least for my second rotation, there was a postdoc in the lab, not for my third rotation, but my second rotation, there was a postdoc. And so if I had questions, usually that was the person who I went to. And so in my current lab, actually, the PI, since she's younger, she's still doing work within the lab. So some PIs will still be doing work within the lab if they're younger. So I can still ask them questions, and then the research scientist, the senior research scientist as well.
And if you don't mind me asking another follow-up to that, one of the things that I had considered when I was kind of picking my lab was the size of the lab. Some people prefer a smaller lab where you might have more of that direct interaction with your PhD advisor. Some people might prefer a larger lab where you might rely more on sort of the peer-to-peer interaction and, talking to your postdocs instead. Was that something that you encountered or considered?
Yeah, so that's why a lot of my rotations were in smaller labs, like 2 to 4 people, because I wanted more interaction with the people within the lab and form those bonds with people in the lab, because ultimately you're going to be there for 4 to 6 years. And depending on how long the postdocs are going to be there, the senior research scientists, and even the other PhD students, you're going to have to get along with those people. And so I wanted a smaller lab to be able to form those bonds with the people that I'm working alongside every day.
Great. How about you, Akanksha? Did any of these factors kind of play into your picking of your rotations?
Yes, definitely. And I'm actually still in the process of it, but I've talked to you about 2. I mean, the one that I'm, the lab that I'm in right now is also technically like an unofficial rotation that I'm doing. And that's going great. And it's a really small lab. Like my PI is also super young. She just started like last fall, like during COVID. So it was just like up and running. And then I've talked to some older PIs, like through Zoom. I've gotten to go in person, meet with the lab members before actually going into the rotation. So I think that really helps, like going into the lab, seeing the workspace and asking them questions about the PI, like, are they more hands-on? Are they more like they let you do everything, and like just the different, I guess, styles of mentoring. So I am going into different labs and talking to the students more so, and then also having discussions with the PIs. But I think asking the students really gives you a good idea of what the PI is like.
That's really good advice. Yeah. Talk to the students, talk to the postdocs. Absolutely. I think we're almost at the end of the session. So if anybody has any last questions, now's your chance to do it. Feel free to unmute and start asking. Any questions?
I have a question. So I've been told that for like going to get your PhD, this like you don't actually pay for like the classes you take or whatever or something like that. But then when I was searching for different programs and stuff, it lists like a price on the website. So I was just wondering from like your guys' experience, do you have to pay for grad school or not? 'Cause I'm still a little confused about that.
It depends on what discipline you're going into. So I don't know where you plan on applying or what kind of programs you plan on applying to. A lot of the STEM PhDs, you're going to have funding for that, and then they waive the tuition. And one of the institutions I applied to, they had listed how much classes cost. And I was like, well, I thought your classes are, or your tuition's waived for your PhD. And so I ended up reaching out to that program, and they're like, we still have to list that on our website as like a legal obligation thing. But in the end, they still waive your your tuition. I mean, it depends. That's something that you have to clarify and look on their website, is if they're going to waive your tuition or not. And then I actually currently get a stipend for my research. And so the first year I was funded through the program, and now I'm funded through the lab or the PI. And so when you're considering a lab, that's something important to consider, is whether that PI has enough funding to pay you or not. Because like either from the start, depending on the program, or after the first year, they're financially responsible for you.
Yeah, it's the same for me in my like program. So it's called a stipend. And then also on the website, it says like full tuition covered, or it's a scholarship usually sometimes, but that just means that your tuition is covered. You only have to pay for books and like depending on like if there's an extra fee, but like the bulk tuition, like an undergrad that you would pay every semester, that's usually done or paid for.
Thank you.
And I'll just add to that and say that, you know, most PhD programs will pay for you to do the coursework as well. But like Akanksha and Colton said, it depends on your lab in terms of whether they'll be able to keep funding you past that, right? So I have heard of some stories where PhD students have to kind of abandon their research in the middle or go to another lab because their lab ran out of funding. So another thing to look into is how much departmental support is available. Usually departments will have like a slush fund, if you will, that if there is a lab that's kind of low on funding and they have a student that's 1 year away from getting their PhD, then, you know, there's other sources of funding you can go for. But yeah, definitely reach out to them and ask